The Silent Colony. The colony of Asterion had been a shining jewel in the distant arm of the galaxy where humans had carved a fragile but promising home. Children played in the open fields beneath the protective dome. Farmers tended to the crops that would feed thousands, and the miners dug deep into the planet's crust to extract valuable minerals. To the people who lived there, it felt like paradise, a new Eden untouched by the greed and violence of the wider galaxy. For years, the colony lived in peace and believed that distance would protect them from the conflicts of alien empires and the politics of the Galactic Council. But peace for humanity was always fragile, for their enemies never forgot the fear that humans carried with them. It began with the faint tremor of the early warning systems. At first, no one believed it could be real. The children playing outside did not understand why the sky above their dome suddenly glowed with strange colors, nor did the parents rushing to gather them realize they were seeing the reflection of hundreds of alien warships entering orbit. The colony governor received a final communication from Earth minutes before the signal was drowned in static. In his voice there was only shock and helpless rage. The aliens had come not to negotiate or to demand tribute, but to erase. When the bombardment began, the colony shook as if the planet itself cried out. Fire rained from the heavens, shattering towers, igniting crops, and boiling rivers to steam. The screams of families filled the underground shelters, but even the deepest bunkers were no protection against the relentless storm unleashed by the invaders. Entire city blocks vanished in seconds, and the blue skies turned black with smoke. Children clung to their parents, terrified, while soldiers fired futilely at the sky with weapons that could not pierce the armor of the enemy. A handful of ships tried to escape the planet's surface, carrying desperate refugees and a few brave souls determined to deliver a warning. Most were destroyed before they left the atmosphere, bursting like sparks against the shields of the alien fleet. Yet one vessel, a battered freighter named Aurora's Light, managed to slip through the chaos. Its engine screamed as it broke past the blockade, carrying within it the final recording of the colony governor. His last words were simple: "They are erasing us. Do not let them succeed." Back on the surface, the fires consumed everything. The aliens showed no mercy, and they spared no time to gloat. To them, humanity was a troublesome species, dangerous in their resilience, unpredictable in their defiance. The decision had been made by cold calculation. Erase one colony as an example, and the rest of humanity would cower in fear. In their arrogance, they believed this would end the threat of humans forever. When the bombardment ceased, Asterion was nothing more than a wasteland. Craters stretched for miles, the rivers boiled dry, and the forests burned to ash. Where once there had been laughter and life, there was only silence. The stars above continued to shine, indifferent witnesses to the massacre. To the invaders, it was done. They departed with no second thought, confident that humanity had been taught its lesson. But deep in the void, the Aurora's Light pushed on, its wounded hull holding together through sheer determination of its pilot, a man named Elias Grant. His body was battered, his mind haunted by the cries of the colony he had left behind. Yet he clung to the controls as if his life were the only thing keeping the memory of his people alive. Every moment he expected the alien ships to appear and finish him, but somehow the small vessel endured, limping toward human space. His mission was clear: deliver the warning, tell the story, make sure no one forgot. When Elias finally reached the edge of Terran-controlled space, he collapsed at the comms station, whispering the message again and again as tears streaked his face. They erased us. Do not let them succeed. His words spread like wildfire through the networks of human colonies, reaching admirals, leaders, and even ordinary workers who paused in shock as they heard of Asterion's fate. Across every system, silence followed, and then something else: rage. The galaxy would soon learn the greatest truth about humanity. To strike at one human colony was to awaken them all. To erase their people was to call forth vengeance beyond imagination. And already, in the hidden shipyards of Earth and Mars and the dark reaches of Titan's forges, the sound of engines and hammers began to rise. Humanity did not forgive. Humanity remembered. And humanity was coming. The Council's laughter far from the burning ruins of Asterion. The halls of the Galactic Council echoed with voices filled with arrogance and self-satisfaction. Alien envoys from dozens of species gathered in the Grand Chamber, a structure built of shining crystal and floating platforms that overlooked the stars. They had heard the news of the human colony's destruction, and they discussed it not with sorrow but with mocking humor. The governor of the Zorath Dominion raised his glass of amber liquid and declared that the human problem had been solved. His words were followed by the laughter of scaled ambassadors, feathered dignitaries, and cold metallic voices of synthetic delegates who all believed that humanity had been taught its place. The council chamber was a place where empires weighed the balance of power, and in that balance humans had always been considered troublesome. They were a young species, brash and unpredictable, spreading quickly across the stars with colonies sprouting like weeds. Other civilizations had spent millennia building cautious alliances and expanding carefully, but humans in just a few centuries had reached into territories others considered sacred. The destruction of Asterion was seen not only as punishment, but as a warning to any human world that dared rise too high. Yet not all in the chamber laughed. A few voices remained quiet, their eyes troubled. Among them was Admiral Korval of the Veyari, a reptilian commander who bore scars across his chest from a long-ago war. He had once fought humans during the skirmishes on the frontier, and had survived where many of his kind had not. To him, humanity was not weak and scattered. They were dangerous precisely because they endured. He tried to speak, his gravelly voice echoing as he reminded the council that humans had survived worse before, that every time they were struck down, they returned stronger and more united. But his warnings were drowned in ridicule. The others called him paranoid, a relic clinging to old battles, unwilling to see that humans were nothing more than prey. The council leader, a tall crystalline being whose body shimmered with inner light, silenced the chamber with a gesture. She announced that the matter of humans was closed. The colony was gone, the message sent, and now resources could return to more important matters like trade routes and border disputes. With finality, she declared that humanity would fade into obscurity, a species reminded of its limits. Applause followed, echoing through the chamber as if the sound itself could erase the memory of human defiance. But even as they laughed and dismissed the danger, reports trickled in from the outer sectors. Patrols had vanished without explanation. Listening posts detected unusual traffic near old Terran shipyards. Traders whispered of convoys moving under heavy guard and strange activity near the moons of Jupiter and Saturn. The council ignored these reports, brushing them aside as human desperation. They believed the Terrans would never recover from the loss of a whole colony, that grief would paralyze them and fear would keep them docile. What they did not see, what they refused to imagine, was that grief had already turned into fury. On Earth, the signal from Aurora's light played again and again in war rooms and living chambers alike. Leaders who had once argued for restraint now sat in silence, their faces hard with resolve. Admirals who had begged for resources in the past now had more volunteers than they could train. Civilians offered their labor freely, turning factories into engines of war. Even those who had never held a weapon began to ask how they could serve, for the memory of Asterion burned too bright to ignore. Humanity's history was filled with loss and struggle, from ancient wars on Earth to the trials of surviving on hostile new worlds. Each time they pushed back harder. Each time they were broken, they rose stronger. The alien council, in its arrogance, saw only numbers on a report, a colony erased from the stars. Humanity saw mothers and fathers, children and friends, a community that had been slaughtered without cause, and for that crime, they would demand an answer. Admiral Korval left the council chamber in silence, his tail lashing in agitation. He knew the truth that the others ignored. He had seen the fire in human eyes when cornered. He had heard their voices as they swore to fight to the last breath. As he looked out at the stars from the balcony of the council station, he felt a chill run through him. He whispered to himself words that none of his peers would dare speak aloud. Humanity will come. They will not forgive. And when they arrive, the galaxy will tremble. The council feasted and celebrated that night, convinced of their victory. They toasted to the fall of Asterion and congratulated themselves for their wisdom. But above the laughter and songs, in the quiet void beyond the reach of their arrogance, the faint hum of engines was already rising. In the darkness, hidden fleets stirred. The forging of something vast had begun, something no council could silence with laughter or decrees. Humanity was awake. The awakening armada across the scattered human colonies and the heart of Sol system, the message of Asterion's destruction echoed like a funeral bell that would not stop ringing. Every man, woman, and child who heard the broadcast from the Aurora's light felt something shift deep inside them. At first it was grief, raw and unbearable, but quickly grief transformed into a fire that united them as nothing else could. Humanity had known loss before, but never like this, never the complete erasure of an entire world, and they would not allow it to stand. On Earth, the governments that had often quarreled over resources and politics set aside their rivalries. The United Terran Command convened in a massive underground chamber carved into the stone beneath the Rockies, where admirals and generals from every branch sat at long steel tables. Screens displayed the final images from Asterion, flames rising, families screaming, the last desperate transmission from the governor. None of the leaders spoke for long moments. They only stared until one voice broke the silence. It was Admiral Reyes, her face scarred from an earlier war against raiders, who stood and declared that the time for patience had ended. Her words were met with nods and clenched fists. The vote to mobilize was unanimous. On Mars, the forges thundered day and night. The red planet's surface glowed with the fire of thousands of factories as workers poured molten alloys into molds for ship hulls and armor plating. Vast assembly yards filled the horizon, and from them rose titanic frames that would soon become carriers and dreadnoughts. The engineers worked without rest, sleeping beside their machines, their hands blackened with oil and their eyes burning with determination. They spoke little, for all of them carried the same image in their minds. The vision of Asterion turned to ash. The moons of Jupiter, once home to research labs and mining stations, were transformed into foundries and shipyards. Ganymede's ice crust was carved open to reveal cavernous docks where destroyers were birthed in secrecy. Callisto's tunnels became barracks for soldiers arriving from across the colonies. Even Europa, once devoted to science, now churned with the sound of weapons production. The fleet was not only being built, it was awakening. Civilians, too, found their place in the great effort. Teachers signed up to train recruits in discipline and tactics. Farmers diverted crops to feed soldiers, and children collected scrap to be melted down for use in ammunition and armor. Humanity was not merely building warships, it was becoming war itself, every hand and every heart driving the armada forward. No one was too small to help, for all felt the weight of the dead pressing on their shoulders. The Admiralty calculated what they would need to face the might of the alien empire that had struck Asterion, and the number was staggering. 700,000 warships, a fleet so vast that even the most powerful empires of the galaxy would struggle to comprehend it. The skeptics said it could not be done, that such a fleet would take centuries to build, but humanity refused to listen. They would do it not in centuries, but in years, in months, even in days if needed. Already stockpiles of hidden vessels, relics of earlier wars, were being reactivated, their hulls reforged and weapons upgraded. Entire scrapyards were emptied as old destroyers were dragged back into service. Humanity's secret was that it had never stopped preparing. Even in times of peace, shipyards had quietly constructed reserves, and now those reserves became the bones of the awakening armada. The training grounds filled with volunteers. Men and women stood shoulder to shoulder, waiting for weapons, waiting for orders. They learned to fly fighters, to command ships, to repair engines under fire. Veterans returned to teach the young, passing down every lesson carved into them by war. For the first time in generations, humanity stood united, not as nations or corporations, but as one people bound by a single oath: vengeance for Asterion. In hidden hangars beneath the oceans of Earth and the frozen crust of Titan, the first warships rolled out. They were black-hulled and bristling with weapons, engines burning like captured suns. Their names were painted in bold white letters across their sides, names chosen to honor the fallen: Asterion's wrath, vengeance of the lost, Aurora's light reborn. Each ship carried not only missiles and cannons, but also the rage of billions. Across the galaxy, whispers spread. Traders spoke of strange human convoys guarded by warships. Alien scouts who ventured near human space vanished without trace. Some said the Terrans were breaking apart in grief, others that they were arming beyond reason. The truth was far greater than any rumor. Humanity was not breaking. Humanity was gathering. In the command center on Earth, Admiral Reyes stood before the assembled admirals and captains. Her voice was steady, her eyes sharp as steel. She spoke of Asterion, of the lives stolen, of the crime that demanded an answer. Then she declared that the fleet would rise, 700,000 warships marching under one banner, and they would not stop until justice was done. Her words carried through the networks to every corner of human space, and those who heard them shouted their approval, their voices echoing into the void. The awakening armada was no longer a dream. It was real and it was coming. The galaxy would soon see what it meant to wound humanity, and the laughter of the council would die in their throats. Shadows of war while the forges of humanity thundered and the shipyards filled the void with iron giants. The rest of the galaxy began to feel a chill that no decree of the council could silence. At first the reports seemed like scattered rumors easy to dismiss. A patrol fleet from the Talari Confederation disappeared near the edge of Sol space, leaving only fragments of distress calls filled with static and fear. A merchant convoy reported being shadowed by silent human cruisers that did not fire, only watched, as if measuring and calculating. Listening stations along the Orion Arm picked up encrypted signals in Terran code, signals that stretched far and wide, threading through sectors where humans were not supposed to be. In the council chambers, these reports were mocked. The crystalline speaker waved them aside, calling them exaggerations born from nervous traders and frightened scouts. Yet beneath the laughter unease stirred. Some envoys whispered of ancient Terran wars, of how quickly the species could adapt and how fiercely they fought when cornered. The more arrogant dismissed these whispers, insisting that the colony of Asterion had been proof that humans could be erased. Still, the silence of vanished fleets and the quiet persistence of those encrypted signals were shadows that lingered in every mind. Admiral Corval of the Veyari walked the halls of the council station with growing dread. He had tried to warn them, telling stories of his battles against humans on the frontier years ago, but none listened. He remembered the human soldiers who had fought even as their fortresses crumbled, remembered the pilots who turned wrecked ships into weapons by ramming them into enemy lines, remembered the eyes of civilians who refused to bow even at the edge of death. Corval knew those eyes had not changed. He felt the same fire smoldering now, unseen but building, and he feared what would come when it finally erupted. Beyond the council's arrogance, the galaxy itself trembled with rumors. On the trade worlds where news traveled faster than fleets, merchants spoke in hushed voices of a human armada unlike anything ever seen. Some said it numbered 100,000 ships, others claimed 1,000,000, but all agreed that it was growing every day. Alien mercenaries who had once fought humans were quick to leave human sectors, taking their pay and vanishing into safer regions, for they knew the old truth that humanity never forgot and never forgave. Meanwhile, in the dark void between stars, human scouts moved like phantoms. They avoided open battles, striking only when necessary, but every strike carried a message. A Talari battleship guarding a border outpost was found adrift, its engines disabled and its crew alive but bound with a simple phrase carved into the hull: "For Asterion." A Zurath supply line collapsed when freighters vanished one after another, their cargoes redirected to human shipyards. The council believed they had crippled humanity by destroying a colony, but now it was their fleets and their trade that suffered the first cuts of the blade. Inside the hidden shipyards, humanity pressed on. The 700,000 warships were no longer just a plan on paper, but an inevitability. The smaller vessels, frigates, destroyers, corvettes, were already complete in staggering numbers, while the great carriers and dreadnoughts neared readiness. Each launch was accompanied by cheers from workers who saw their labor take form, who knew that every ship carried with it the memory of the dead of Asterion. Children painted the hulls with names of lost family members, making the ships into floating monuments of vengeance. The galaxy began to sense the truth, though few dared speak it aloud. The humans were not preparing for defense. They were not digging in behind walls or hiding behind treaties. They were preparing to march outward. The fleet was not a shield but a blade, aimed with precision at those who had thought themselves safe. The shadows of war grew darker with every passing day, and even those who once mocked began to feel the weight of fear pressing down on their hearts. Admiral Corval stood once more before the council, his scales catching the cold light of the chamber. He spoke with urgency, warning that the humans were not broken, that the silence of their borders was not weakness but preparation. He told them of whispers from spies who claimed to have seen the vast fleets rising from Titan's forges, of caravans of weapons and supplies flowing into Sol space. Yet again the council laughed, dismissing him as a paranoid soldier lost in old grudges. They refused to see the storm coming. As Corval left the chamber, he looked to the stars and felt the weight of inevitability. He knew the humans were gathering their strength, knew that every whisper and every vanished fleet was just the beginning. He whispered softly to himself that the galaxy had made a mistake it could never undo. The shadows of war were lengthening, and soon the dawn would come not with light but with fire. The first strike. The galaxy had grown accustomed to silence along the Terran borders, a silence the Council believed was the quiet of fear. But silence can be the stillness before a storm, and when the storm broke it came with a fury that shattered illusions across every star system within reach. The first strike was not a cautious probe but a declaration written in fire and steel, carried on the backs of the warships humanity had forged in its rage. It began in the Zorath sector where a fleet of alien cruisers guarded vital trade lanes. For decades they had bullied human merchants, extorting goods and crippling smaller colonies under the pretense of council law. They laughed when reports reached them of human activity, convinced that no force could challenge their dominance. Their laughter ended in the span of a single hour. Out of the darkness of interstellar space came hundreds of Terran destroyers moving in formation, as if one mind guided them. Without warning, the humans unleashed a storm of kinetic rounds and plasma fire, ripping through shields and armor. The alien fleet tried to form ranks, tried to return fire, but they were scattered like dust before a hurricane. By the time the survivors limped away, only wreckage and burning hulks remained. The trade lanes cleared in one brutal sweep. News of the destruction traveled faster than the survivors themselves. Across alien systems, rumors spread of Terran fleets appearing where none were expected, striking hard and vanishing before reinforcements could arrive. In the Zorath Dominion, entire outposts went silent, their transmissions ending abruptly with the cry of alarms. Stations that had stood for centuries as symbols of dominance were reduced to twisted metal in minutes. Every strike carried the same message painted on debris or broadcast in encrypted signals. Remember Asterion. The scale of the attacks grew with each passing week. What began with destroyers and frigates soon escalated to carriers and battleships. Human fleets moved in waves, coordinated with precision that left enemy admirals stunned. They struck supply lines, crippled shipyards, and targeted communication hubs. Entire sectors dimmed as their infrastructure was torn away. The aliens had thought humanity too fractured to fight as one, but now they faced a united armada that moved with terrifying purpose. Civilians across the galaxy watched the battles through intercepted transmissions, their screens filled with the sight of black-hulled Terran ships cutting through opposition. To some, the sight inspired fear, to others a secret admiration. Many smaller species who had suffered under the arrogance of the great empires whispered that perhaps humanity was delivering justice not just for themselves, but for all who had been trampled under the Council's decrees. For the first time in centuries, the balance of power seemed uncertain. The Council scrambled to respond. Emergency meetings filled the crystalline halls as envoys shouted at one another, demanding explanations and strategies. But their unity was shattered. Some insisted on direct confrontation. Others begged for negotiation, and still others tried to deny the scale of the threat. Every day more reports arrived of fleets destroyed, of worlds falling silent, of refugees fleeing before the advancing human armada. The arrogance that had once filled the chamber was gone, replaced by fear that clung to every word. Amid the chaos, Admiral Corval remained grim. He had warned them, and now his warnings had come to life. He urged preparation for a defense of their core worlds, but he knew it would not be enough. The humans were not simply fighting for territory or power. They were avenging their dead, and no wall of ships or words would stop them. On the bridge of the flagship Vengeance of Asterion, Admiral Rhea stood at the center of her command deck, her gaze fixed on the star map before her. Around her, the hum of machinery and the steady voices of officers carried the rhythm of war. Reports of victories came in one after another, yet her expression remained hard, for she knew this was only the beginning. They had bloodied the enemy, broken their confidence, and shattered their fleets. But the true heart of the empire that had erased Asterion still lay ahead. She raised her hand and gave the next order, her voice clear and unyielding. The armada would continue its march. They would burn a path through every fleet, every station, every defense until they reached the seat of the empire itself. Only then would the debt be paid. Only then would the silence of Asterion be answered with justice. Across the galaxy, the first strike was complete, but it was only the opening chapter of a war that would reshape the stars. Humanity had spoken with the voice of thunder, and the galaxy was listening. The breaking point. The galaxy had seen wars before, conflicts that stretched for centuries between empires both ancient and proud. But nothing in memory compared to the storm humanity unleashed. From one sector to another, the Terran fleets advanced with relentless fury, each victory driving the survivors of their enemies into deeper panic. The great powers that had once thought themselves untouchable now scrambled to defend their heartlands. And still the black-hulled armada pressed on without pause. It was no longer rumor or shadow, no longer whispers in trade stations or frightened reports from patrols. It was war laid bare across the stars, and at the center of it was a force of will that refused to bend or falter. In the span of months, entire sectors had fallen silent. Human fleets carved their way through defenses like blades through paper, leaving wreckage in their wake. Stations that had stood for generations crumbled under barrages of kinetic fire. Alien admirals who had laughed at the thought of Terran vengeance now found themselves staring at maps filled with red markers spreading closer and closer to their capitals. The truth that had been denied for so long was now undeniable. Humanity was not only surviving, humanity was winning. The Council could delay no longer. Under the glow of their crystal chamber, the envoys met in desperation. Voices rose in panic as they demanded action, demanded unity, demanded that someone find a way to stop the Terran flood before it reached their core worlds. For the first time in centuries, their divisions vanished under the weight of fear, and plans were made to gather the greatest fleet the galaxy had ever seen. Tens of thousands of ships from every allied empire would join together, forming a wall of firepower to halt the human advance. It was to be the decisive battle, the breaking point where either humanity would be crushed or the galaxy would fall to its knees before them. On the human side, the Armada gathered as well. From Earth, Mars, Titan, and the countless shipyards of the colonies came fleets beyond counting, carriers bristling with fighters, dreadnoughts with guns that could split moons, destroyers fast as lightning, all joined together under a single command. The admirals knew what awaited them, knew the enemy had gathered its strength, but there was no hesitation. The men and women of the fleet carried the memory of Asterion within them, and no enemy fleet, no matter how vast, could weigh heavier than the silence of their dead. When the two forces finally met, the stars themselves seemed to shudder. The battlefield stretched across a sector filled with asteroids and drifting debris, a graveyard of old wars now chosen as the stage for the greatest clash in living memory. Alien fleets deployed in perfect formation, their ships gleaming like polished blades, their numbers so great that even human sensors strained to count them. At the heart of the formation stood the Council's chosen flagship, a Leviathan vessel armed with weapons said to rival the strength of small suns. Opposite them, the Terran Armada advanced, dark ships like shadows rising against the stars, engines burning with the fury of billions. At the front stood the flagship Vengeance of Asterion, Admiral Reyes at its command chair, her eyes hard and unyielding. She gave no speech of glory, only the reminder that this battle was for the children lost in fire, for the families buried in ash, for the silence that would never again be filled with laughter. That reminder was enough. Across the fleet, voices rose as one, swearing to fight until the enemy line shattered. The battle began with a thunder that shook the void. Waves of fighters surged forward, clashing in blinding flashes of light. Capital ships unleashed their broadsides, beams and slugs tearing across kilometers of space. The asteroids themselves cracked and splintered under the force of the weapons. For hours the fleets clashed, neither side yielding, losses mounting on both ends. Alien admirals watched in horror as human ships refused to retreat even when burning, hurling themselves into enemy lines with suicidal determination. Every destroyed Terran vessel seemed to take two enemies with it, every loss fueling the fury of those who remained. By the third day of battle, the alien formation began to fray. The Council's fleet was vast, but it was made of allies forced together by fear, their unity brittle under strain. Orders clashed. Communication broke down and hesitation spread like poison. Against them stood humanity united as one, moving with the precision of a single hand. The tide shifted slowly at first, then all at once. Terran warships broke through the center, carving a path straight toward the Leviathan flagship. The defenders rallied, pouring fire into the attackers, but it was not enough. Humanity pressed on with a fury that could not be stopped. When the Leviathan finally fell, torn apart by concentrated fire from 100 Terran dreadnoughts, the rest of the alien fleet faltered. Panic spread. Ships broke formation, some fleeing, others fighting blindly. Humanity did not relent. They pursued, driving the enemy back, shattering what remained of the greatest fleet the Council had ever assembled. When the smoke cleared, the void was littered with wreckage. Thousands of ships had been reduced to drifting corpses of steel, but amid the silence, one truth rang louder than any cannon. Humanity had broken the line. The galaxy had thrown its might against them, and still the Terrans stood bloodied but unbroken, their fleet intact and their will unshaken. The breaking point had come, and it was the galaxy that had shattered, vengeance complete. The battlefield where the Council's grand fleet had been shattered still glowed with drifting wreckage and burning husks, yet the human armada did not slow. Across the stars, the message spread like fire through dry grass. The galaxy's greatest defense had been broken, its might undone by the fury of 700,000 Terran warships, and nothing now stood between humanity and the heart of the Empire that had ordered Asterian's destruction. Panic swept through alien worlds as citizens looked to the skies, wondering when the shadow of Terran vengeance would arrive. Governments collapsed under fear, rebellions broke out, and allies who once trusted the Council turned away, unwilling to share its fate. For the Terran fleet there was no pause, no celebration, no respite. Admiral Reyes stood on the bridge of the vengeance of Asterian as reports streamed in from every sector. Their path was clear and nothing would turn them aside. The fleets reorganized, ships repaired what they could, wounded soldiers tended to each other, and still the order echoed through the network of command. Forward, always forward. As the Armada advanced, the Empire that had once mocked humanity realized the truth too late. They scrambled to prepare their homeworld, fortifying orbital defenses, deploying legions of soldiers and filling the void with weapons platforms. Every resource was dragged to the capital in desperation. Yet fear gnawed at every soldier and citizen, for they had seen what Terrans could do when their wrath was awakened. The name of Asterian was whispered even among those who had never known its people, carried as a curse and a warning that could not be silenced. When the Terran fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the enemy homeworld, the sky filled with black ships stretching farther than the eye could see. The defenders fired the first shots, desperate blasts of plasma and missiles streaking into the void. But the Armada moved as one, shields shimmering, formations tight. The answering barrage from humanity was like the roar of an angry god. Weapon platforms crumbled, orbital fortresses split apart, and the defenders who had sworn to hold their ground were swept aside like leaves in a storm. Through the chaos, the vengeance of Asterian led the charge. Admiral Reyes gave her orders with calm precision, her voice carrying through every channel. Destroy their fleets, burn their fortresses, leave nothing standing that can rise against us again. Across the world below, citizens looked up at the night sky and saw it blaze with fire as Terran. Warships rained destruction upon the very seat of power that had condemned Asterian. Inside, the council chambers, the leaders who had laughed at humanity trembled. They sent frantic transmissions begging for parley, offering concessions, even surrender. But the Terran fleet pressed on unmoved by words. This was not conquest for riches or territory. It was justice carved in steel. The leaders who had chosen erasure as policy would now see what it meant to be erased in turn. On the surface, cities shook as orbital strikes cut through defenses. Soldiers tried to rally, but their commands were drowned in the panic of their people. Towers of crystal and steel collapsed into ash. The empire that had stood for thousands of years crumbled in hours, its pride shattered beneath the weight of Terran vengeance. At last, the council's capital lay in ruins, its defenses broken, its leaders dragged from their hiding places to stand before humanity. Admiral Reyes appeared before them through the shimmering light of a hollow transmission, her eyes hard as iron. She spoke no words of mercy, for mercy had not been given to Asterian. She reminded them of the colony's children who had screamed as fire consumed their homes, of the governor's last plea carried on the aurora's light, of the silence that had followed. Then she declared that humanity had delivered its answer, and that the galaxy would never again doubt the price of striking at their people. The final order was given. The Terran fleet unleashed one last barrage that leveled what remained of the Council's seat of power. The homeworld itself shook under the fury, and when the dust cleared, only scorched ruins and silence remained. Humanity had come, humanity had avenged, and humanity had won. Across the stars, the message echoed into every corner of the galaxy. Empires that had once mocked humanity now bowed their heads in fear and respect. Smaller races that had suffered under the arrogance of the great powers looked to the Terrans not as destroyers, but as proof that even the mighty could bleed. And within the hearts of every human, the silence of Asterion was finally answered. Admiral Reyes stood once more at her command chair, her eyes on the map of stars before her. Around her, officers waited for new orders, but for the first time in months there was only quiet. The vengeance was complete. The dead had been honored. Asterion had been avenged, she whispered softly, words only for herself and the memory of those lost. It is done. Humanity remembers. Humanity endures. And so the greatest war of vengeance in the history of the galaxy came to its close, leaving behind a truth carved forever into the stars. To erase one human world was to awaken them all, to call forth a storm that could not be stopped, to summon 700,000 warships that carried with them the will of an unbreakable people, the judgment of humanity. The galaxy was not silent after the fall of the Empire's homeworld, for silence could not contain the weight of what had been unleashed. Across countless stars, news of the Terran Armada's victory spread faster than light, carried by terrified survivors, intercepted transmissions, and the whispers of traitors who had seen the black-hulled warships moving like shadows of vengeance. Entire civilizations paused in fear, their rulers staring at the stars with new eyes, for they had believed humanity was fragile, a young species that could be broken with a single strike. Instead, they had discovered a truth more terrible than they had ever imagined, that to wound humanity was to invite destruction beyond measure. On Earth and the colonies, bells rang not for triumph but for remembrance. The names of the lost from Asterion were read aloud in plazas, broadcast through networks etched into the steel of monuments that would stand for ages. Families wept, children held the hands of their parents, and soldiers who had fought through fire and blood stood with bowed heads. Humanity had not forgotten why the war had begun. It was never for conquest or for the thrill of power. It had been for the children who never grew, for the homes turned to ash, for the silence that had cried out to the stars. The vengeance was complete, but the pain remained, a scar written into the soul of a species. The council no longer existed. Its halls of crystal lay shattered, its envoys scattered or dead. Those who had laughed at the fate of Asterion were gone, consumed in the same flames they had once ordered upon the innocent. Other empires who had once sneered at Terran ambition now watched with care, understanding that humanity did not strike without reason, but that once stirred, their fury was unstoppable. Treaties were rewritten, alliances reshaped, and everywhere the question lingered of whether humanity would remain a destroyer or become a guardian of balance. Admiral Reyes walked the quiet halls of her flagship, the Vengeance of Asterion. Around her the crew moved with weary steps, men and women who had seen too much death yet still carried themselves with pride. She paused before the great viewing port, gazing out at the broken remains of the enemy homeworld below. Her reflection in the glass was stern, but her eyes carried the weight of sorrow. She had led them to victory, but it was not glory she felt. It was the heavy burden of knowing that vengeance always carried a cost, that in avenging the dead she had forged new scars in the living. Her words to her officers were not of triumph, but of remembrance. She told them that humanity would endure not because of its weapons or its ships, but because it remembered the value of every life lost. She told them that Asterion lived on in every Terran heart, and that as long as humanity carried memory with them, no enemy could truly erase them. The officers saluted with solemn faces, for they understood her meaning. The war was over, but the story would live forever. Across the stars, new whispers rose, not of fear alone, but of respect. Small nations who had long been oppressed by the arrogance of the great powers saw hope in humanity's victory. Hope that the balance of the galaxy could change. Some reached out with offers of friendship, others with quiet admiration, but all understood the same truth. Humanity had proven itself unbreakable. When the vengeance of Asterion turned from the ruins of the fallen empire and set course for home, the fleet followed in silent formation. 700,000 warships, scarred by battle but unbroken, stretched across the void. Their engines glowed like suns, their hulls bore the names of the fallen, and their crews carried with them the memory of vengeance fulfilled. They were not conquerors. They were survivors who had answered injustice with the only language the galaxy understood. And as the Black Armada vanished into the stars, one truth echoed across every corner of the galaxy. To erase a human world was to summon the storm, and that storm would never stop until justice was done. Humanity had spoken, and the galaxy would never forget the sound of their voice. The end